6,000 Scots, 20,000 English, a single narrow wooden bridge between them and everything that the King of England claimed as order. That is the image. A handful of spears, a river, and the weight of an empire pressing to cross a plank no wider than a cart. This is Stirling Bridge, 1297, the day a small, determined force turned hopeless odds into an unforgettable victory. The story begins not with glory, but with pressure. Edward I of England had spent years bending Scotland to his will, castles taken, nobles cowed, young rulers replaced with his agents. For many Scots, there was no choice left but resistance, not as a polished army, but as a patchwork of local leaders, fugitives and men who would rather fight at home than live under a foreign sheriff. Out of that unrest rose two names: William Wallace, a regional leader who had become the face of a growing rebellion, and Andrew de Moray, a commander who had been wounded earlier but returned to direct men and plan action beside Wallace. Together, they did not have an army to match English numbers. They had something else: knowledge of ground, timing, and the will to use both. Stirling matters because Stirling is a door. The bridge across the River Forth links the lowlands, where armies gather and knights ride, to the highlands and the routes by which a cause survives. Control of that crossing meant control of movement, and in this war of attrition, control of hope. For the Scots, it was not merely a place to fight. It was the place to force a fight on their terms. The English column that came to relieve or reassert control boasted heavy knights, trained infantry, and the discipline of a royal army. On paper, on open ground, they were irresistible, but they could not all cross a single narrow span at once. A wooden bridge, perhaps only able to carry a few men abreast, does not permit the deployment of squadrons or the rapid support of distant units. It creates a choke, a place where numbers are reduced to trickles, where the great force becomes a series of exposed pockets. Wallace and de Moray understood that. They chose the far bank. They arrayed skirmishers and spear-bearing infantry where the bridge emptied onto land. They left the river itself as a blind partner, wide enough to break a rout, cold and swift enough to make retreat hazardous. What the Scots lacked in armour and horses, they compensated with discipline and placement. Spear points held like a wooden wall, shields braced. Archers and slingers harried any who tried to form beyond that bridgehead. The point was simple. Let the English come. Let them clog the bridge. Then let the bridge do what bridges sometimes do in war: turn an advance into a bottleneck and turn courage into panic. What followed is, in outline, familiar in military history. The attacker stretched thin across a narrow approach. The defender strikes when the attacker is vulnerable. But the drama at Stirling came in the details and the timing. English troops began to cross in ordered formations, cavalry leading where possible, infantry following. For a while the crossing was cautious. The river forced restraint. Commanders ashore could not suddenly throw the full weight of their numbers into the fight. On the far side, a modest number of Scots met the first contingent. They fought hard and with purpose. They gave ground when required. They did not break. Then, as many later reconstructions suggest, the crucial moment arrived. A significant portion of English men were already across, mounted knights and armoured infantry pushing forward, confident they could sweep the Scots aside. Behind them, the bridge still funneled reinforcements, baggage and men in armour that could not turn quickly. The English on the far bank were not yet a coherent force. They were exposed, heavy, and isolated from the bulk of their army. Sensing this, the Scots moved. It was not a reckless charge, so much as a concerted, timed assault that exploited the English vulnerability. Spears found gaps between armour. As panic began to spread among those first ranks, the congested bridge worked against them. Horses balked. Men fell. Those on the bridge could not easily retreat, because the path back was narrow and jammed. The river rushed at the feet of the routed. Some accounts tell of men slipping into water, of armour weighing men down. How many were lost to drowning versus the sword is debated. The essential truth is, The bridge became a trap. Sound matters in a moment like that. Hooves on wood, a shout, the creak of strained timbers, the crush of bodies trying to force a way back. For the English commanders, orders could not move fast enough. For the men on the far bank, the realization that they were cut off changed the fight from organized assault into a desperate scramble. Discipline broke. Panic is contagious in armies, as in crowds. A halt becomes a collapse. Hugh de Cressingham, an English official attached to the expedition, and the Earl of Surrey, representing English command in the field, had to manage the unfolding crisis. Whether through miscalculation, a misread of the river, or a fatal underestimation of how quickly a narrow approach could turn lethal, they failed to restore order. The mass and quality of the English force mattered less than the geometry of the battlefield. 20,000 men could not all fit where the fighting was happening, and the portion that did was increasingly isolated and crushed. Andrew de Moray, though wounded earlier in the campaign, had helped shape the response on that bank. Contemporary chronicles and later accounts emphasize that this was not the triumph of a single chieftain, but of coordinated leadership that blended Wallace's boldness with de Moray's organizational skill. The men who held the line were a mix of the local levies and seasoned fighters who understood that a spear held at the right moment could end the charge of a knight. They were not romanticized heroes in plated armor. Many were farmers, tradesmen, and ordinary men who nonetheless formed an extraordinary defense. The turning point was brutal and quick. Isolated English pockets were overwhelmed. Men retreating across the bridge met a living barrier. Men behind them could not form up. Horses, confusion, and the river completed a perfect storm. Once the English line began to unravel, it spread. Men who had expected to rely on royal discipline found that discipline absent when bodies clogged their way. The rout accelerated. Some surrendered. Some perished. Others fled into the surrounding countryside, their fear leaving a longer impression than any loss in banners. In the aftermath, the consequences were both concrete and symbolic. The victory at Stirling Bridge did not end the war. Edward I's resources and determination ensured that this was a reprieve rather than a final settlement. But the win shattered a pervasive belief that English arms were invincible in Scotland. It proved that terrain and timing, coupled with determined leadership, could neutralize an opponent's numerical and cavalry superiority. It gave the Scottish resistance a rallying symbol, and lifted morale across a country that had known only coercion and accommodation for years. William Wallace and Andrew de Moray emerged from Stirling with reputations transformed. They were hailed as leaders and organizers of resistance. Later, they would be named guardians of the realm, tasked with holding and organizing that resistance into something more than a string of raids. The victory entered into lore, songs, chronicles, and the long memory of a people fighting for self-determination. Yet the tale is not pure triumph. It is also a lesson in the high cost of medieval combat, a scene of panic, of men trampled, of those who drowned or were cut down. The victory came at a price, and the war continued. What makes Stirling Bridge enduring is not only that it was an upset, but that it teaches a simple and stubborn truth about warfare. Ground and timing can make the strongest into the vulnerable, and the few into the decisive. A bridge is, in that sense, a character in the story, indifferent, wooden and finite. It can carry trade and travel, or it can become the place where an army perishes when strategy turns it into a funnel. Years on, people would tell different versions of that day. Some accounts add color, others lean into legend. Later retellings have smoothed edges, emphasized heroics, or credited single acts that are difficult to verify. The core, however, is steady. In September 1297, at Stirling Bridge, a force of roughly 6,000 Scots faced a far larger English host. By choosing the place of battle and holding their nerve, they turned a narrow span into the site of a victory that resounded far beyond the riverbanks. If this story has gripped you, and you want more deep-dive accounts of battles where terrain and timing decide the fate of nations, consider subscribing. There are more of these moments to unpack. Stirling's victory did not write the final chapter of the Wars of Independence, but it rewrote what people believed possible. It made leaders. It birthed legends. It left a lesson. That in war, as in life, size seldom matters as much as sense. A well-chosen place and a well-held line can change history. The bridge stands in memory as a narrow stage on which courage, craft, and circumstance collided, and on that collision, a nation found a voice. If you want to follow what came next, how this victory shaped the campaigns that followed, check the linked video on the aftermath. And if this tale moved you, like and share it with someone who loves history told close to the ground.